Hi, I'm Catherine Llewellyn, the host of the podcast. You can find out all about Truth and Transcendence on truthandtranscendence.com. And you can find out all about me on beingspace.world, where you will find my online coaching offering as well as my UK-based workshops. The Freedom of Spirit workshop for liberation and empowerment, the Pellower Radical Shift in Consciousness workshop for spiritual expansion, and transformational coaching for exploring the mind-body-spirit connection on the expansive path. You can also support the podcast by actually making a donation. I hope you enjoy the show. Welcome to Truth and Transcendence. You can find all our episodes on truthandtranscendence.com. So today I'm delighted to welcome back special guest Jonathon Aslay. And Jonathan's been on before, and that was episode 214. So if you enjoy our conversation today, please do go and check out that episode on truthandtranscendence.com, episode 214, but also on the YouTube channel. So Jonathon is actually a dating coach with over 195,000 YouTube subscribers. He's on a mission to encourage both men and women to fully love themselves with his new book, What the Heck is Self-Love Anyway?, which is packed with fun, engaging, spiritual and personal growth practices. And his dynamic midlife love mastery mentorship program, try saying that quickly, which inspires hundreds of people daily around the world. So episode 214 is where we talk all about that. But towards the end of that conversation, Jonathon lets slip that he has a very particular take on the topic of life after death. And that take he has on that actually has really helped him in many aspects of his life, but in particular in his work. So I said, well, I think you better come back on. So Jonathon has kindly come back on today to talk about life after death. And I'm just going to tell you where you can find him on YouTube. Just literally look for Jonathon Aslay, Jonathon Aslay. So, Jonathon, thank you so much for coming back on the show.
Well, I'm really happy to be here. Thank you so much, Catherine, and I look forward to this conversation.
Exactly. Well, I think when you raised it before, I kind of got the impression this is something you don't always talk about on podcasts. Maybe that's not correct, but you seemed to suggest that you thought that your particular view on this topic was perhaps a little bit unusual or different.
Yeah, in my own work, it doesn't come up only to the extent, and for those that if you do go back and watch the previous episode, I shared that in 2018, I lost my 19-year-old son to an accident. And in my grieving process, one of the things I did amongst a number of things was to do psychedelic therapy to process it. And quite frankly, I have this perception that through psilocybin, particularly I use psilocybin in a ceremonial format, that I would be able to connect with him on, what affectionately is the other side, or at least that's what I affectionately call it, the other side. And it's interesting because in my first go around, let me reframe that. I had done it 30 years prior in my 20s, and then now have done it, again in my 50s. I had a visitation from him. And whether that's me projecting my own stuff or it really did happen, I don't know. All I can say is it felt very real to me. And since then, and this was back in 2019 when I did that journey, I've subsequently done 30 plus ceremonies, which includes, making a request to connect with him while I do ceremony.
Wow. Okay, so that was about connecting, interacting with somebody who is kind of, quote, on the other side.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. And what was that like when you began to have that experience?
Yeah, and before I forget, I want to interject this and then I want to respond to that. What also from that experience, I became rather curious on what happens when we transition. So it wasn't just solely then from that vantage point of doing ceremony to connect with him. I began from my own curiosity of reflecting on, we'll call it death or the fear of death in this context. But coming back to your question about what did it feel like, it's interesting because it's describing a feeling or describing a thought or really trying to describe a dream. Let me even go to that context, because when you're on the medicine, it's hard to differentiate between the dream and the real world. And in my consciousness, when you're on the medicine, you're in the real world, and this is the dream, so to speak, or at least I have a perception related to that. So much like trying to describe when you wake up in the morning, it's interesting because I had a very fascinating dream this morning, but I didn't write it down. So almost all memory of it has escaped me. And so, in that same vein, to describe what I felt, one thing I didn't do was journal about it, which would keep that more, maybe a little more concrete, a little more finite to describe how I felt. But or at least what happened, let me put it in that context, what happened versus what I felt was, well, I felt a little sense of relief and the kind of, because the message I got is, hey, I'm doing fine. Like that's the message that came from that experience is, hey, I'm doing fine. Um, and by the way, over the years, that's expanded a bit, that messaging from him. But that was the concrete message is, hey, I'm doing great. You don't have to worry about me. That's what, that's the emotional effect, or that's the message that created a level of calmness for me, a level of love in that it's okay that his physical presence isn't here because he's okay. Like, whereas oftentimes, or at least I know in my past, I would look at death from a completely different lens.
Yes, how beautiful. Isn't that wonderful that you could have that experience? And that's
Yeah.
some people some people say that after somebody has passed over, that they're going to be kind of interested in interacting with people who are still here on this physical plane for a while, but not very long, and then they want to move on to another level, and that then they'd rather not be bothered, right? So some people feel like they'd rather not be bothered after they've then moved on. So what's your sense in relationship to that?
Oh my God. As you're saying that, I'm like, I can't wait to tell you what one of the last messages I had with him. So I want to say this was around 2023. So almost at the time of this recording, 2 years ago. Um, I went into ceremony, and I always would say, like, I would ask the medicine, what message do you have for me? And then I would always ask, what message would come through from Connor, my son. And so we had this brief visitation, and I mean, and he literally said, "Dad, I'm doing fine. Stop bugging me." Like, I'm doing fine. Stop bugging me. Like I'm off. I'm hanging out with grandma. I'm hanging out with the crew. I am just having a grand old time. You don't need to. I'm doing fine. I need you to, and not to suggest he said move on. It wasn't that, but just, there's nothing more I have to say to you. And, and as I took that in, both in a humorous way and in a sad way, um, I felt it was time to, and I don't like to say the word let go because that's not effectively what's happening, but it's really just accepting that everything is okay. And I still get visitations from him in different ways. Um, there's two unique ways I get visitations, and I don't want to go off on that tangent for a moment, but let's just say he's still around, he still checks in with me, but I don't necessarily need to talk to him in the same way because he's like, I'm fine, don't bug me.
Understood. Yeah. So the presence is there, but the need to articulate ideas back and forth is not as required
Exactly.
as it
Well
was.
said.
Yeah. Beautiful. Great. Well, how lovely. I think that's just so beautiful. And isn't that interesting that that last message from him was like that? Because I haven't had that experience of I've never had the experience of actually going into ceremony to ask someone to connect to me, but I have had experiences of people just showing up, in a dream.
Yes.
When I'm in a dream, actually asleep in a dream, or when I'm awake, but I'm in what I might call a very still space, a kind of meditative state space, and they're present, and sometimes there's this sense they've got something to say. Um, but I was quite interested in that thing of, if surely if they've transcended to another level, do they want to be bothered with our nonsense, from where we are? So
Well, I could certainly project what I think he would say, because of my experience with him. But what this experience did, and I think it leans into this conversation that we're going to have, centers around, and I'm merely sharing my perspective of what happens when we transition, and 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 in particular, our fear around it, or at least my fear around it. Let me just say this. Um, um, I I would say I'm very similar to most people where my mortality, well, for me, I'm at a point where I'm, in the later chapters of my life, and the days in front of me are shorter than the days behind me. And to try to make sense, meaning of my life and what's going to happen in the next decade or so, has been a source of curiosity for me. And particularly, from a spiritual perspective, because I kind of subscribe to we are spiritual beings having a human experience. I mean, to that narrative, that feels true for me. Whether it is true or not, I have no clue. I have no idea if when we transition, it's just the dial tone and we're done and that's it. But I hold space that there's a soul, a spirit inside of me that communes with a collective consciousness of some sort. But I have some fascinating perceptions around that. I'm going to share them. I mean, I think our purpose today is for me to share them, and they're in no particular order. So is it okay if I share one example?
I'd like you to share as much as you would like to. I'm really interested, and I also think it's really interesting for, we've all got our different take on this. And I will also just say right off the bat, for all of us, it's perception, because you can't know something unless you're there. So
Yeah.
we just get that one out the way. So if anyone comes in and says, if anyone listening to this is thinking, well, that's not true, my response is, well, how do you know?
Yeah.
And equally, yeah,
Exactly. This is
how do you know? Give me a call, right? So yeah.
So one of my perceptions that is the strongest of them all, and there's multiple perceptions. One centers around when we transition, and we let's just I'm going to affectionately say we go to the campground in the sky, and you're sitting with your soul tribe. That's roughly, in my mind, 20 people, and it's hard to tell, just because like this is trying to explain a dream. And you're now at the campfire, and you're with your soul tribe. And when you arrive, there is one of your soul brothers or sisters is sharing the story of their life. And as you get there, let's just say they live to be 80 years old and that they're at the 20-year-old mark, okay? And they're literally sharing their life day by day, day by day, day by day. So it effectively takes another 60 years for them to finish their share. And you're sitting there and you're listening and taking it in. And now time is an illusion. So when I say it, it's not, the literal 60 years, but that's effectively what happens. And as they're sharing their day by day, minute by minute, the whole experience, there's some things you're like, you really did that? Wow, how cool. And please forgive me because this might sound a little bit toxic. You murdered somebody. Oh, wow, that's cool. Like, in other words, we accept every facet of a person. And please forgive me, I know that sounded somewhat toxic, but the idea is around unconditional love with your soul tribe, accepting the good, the bad, and even ugly of what someone has done. Now, and when I say how cool, I don't mean it like to affirm it. It's just, wow, how fascinating, but coming from an unconditional place. Um, and even, like all the little nooks and crannies of a person's, personality, their judgments, their fears, we're sitting there in absolute acceptance um of this person's experience. And then, but it's not your turn yet. You've got to wait for somebody else. And there's an elder, within the group, and there's a person whose soul is much younger, and they're all over the place sharing their experience. And this is one of the perceptions I have. And then when, then we go back and do this again, this experience. And I have some thoughts on how that kind of unfolds. But that's just one thing that happens is we get to sit with our soul tribe and share the nooks and crannies, the good, the bad, even the ugly experiences, um, under the presence of absolute love, unconditional acceptance, that sort of thing.
What a beautiful, beautiful scenario that is. And I'm just imagining, that's an experience of heaven, isn't it? Having completely accepted it for being able to share everything and feeling completely accepted around all of it. I think that's an experience that we crave, many of us, that kind of acceptance experience.
Yeah, and I like the campfire analogy because one, you're telling the allegory of your life. You're telling maybe even the hero's journey of your life with your trusted tribe, that group that it isn't necessarily, people that I know in my current circles. It could be, like we oftentimes think of people in our lives as part of our soul tribe, but it may not be that. It may not be our children. It may be, it may be completely different entities and souls. And so we're sharing from that space of like a campfire. You're bundled up. It's the light of love represents the fire, or the fire represents the light of love. You're warmed by it, and you're sharing these experiences without, from a place of love, and even, the shame, the judgments, and there's a reflection of ownership in this experience. Like, look, I wasn't a perfect, human being. I was a very flawed human being. I said things that hurt other people's feelings, and I've judged people for their actions. And I'm coming at it from a place of unconditional love for myself, as well as the acceptance and unconditional love of everyone else. And so that's like, and that might be the way station. Like that experience might be the way station for another experience, and you might come back down. And I have a couple perceptions around, what happens when we come back. Our soul says, oh, I want to do this over. And I have a couple perceptions on that has multiple planes of perceptions associated. So one is in the continuum of earthly time. I believe we have been reincarnated to some degree, whether we've experienced it as a man, whether we've experienced it as a woman, whether we have experienced it as a king, whether we've experienced it as a pauper or a slave. Throughout the history of humanity, I believe that there are like some not ancestral, but experiences that bring us to this timeline. That's one perception I have. Another perception I have is we do this life exactly over again. like Groundhog Day. And in other words, if you live to be 80 years old, you come back and do it exactly the same way, exact parents, but you have some perception of the previous experience that represents your higher self. So, I do believe that we have a divinity within us. We have a higher self that's represented by our intuition. And so one perception I have is, okay, I'm on 3,000 of this journey, this exact experience. I'm on, number 3,000. I'm just picking a number just randomly. And with each one, the more I connect with my higher self, the faster I move through this experience from a, let's just say, a healthier way. And that's not even an accurate statement, the word healthy, but just more aligned way. That's another perception I have. And I vacillate between this one and the one I just shared with you because, when I transition, am I going to show up in, 100 years from now in another version? And what would that look like? I mean, I tend to believe we just do it over again like Groundhog Day. That's one of my, I would say another perception, and if you want to unpack any of these, please interrupt me, or interject. But I also play with the idea that we are in some sort of matrix, if you will, that this is a simulation of some sort. And I've played with that perception for years of that. And it's funny because I'm even having a dialogue with ChatGPT about it right now, processing that perception of are we in a simulation? And so, and I think the reason why I do this is so I don't fear the transition as much. If I believe that there is some genuine meaning, there's some purpose, there's some evolution. And that doesn't mean, okay, I get permission to go kill someone because I just get to do this over again, or I can commit suicide because, I can do this over again. I think there's a sacredness to life as well, but I don't have to beat myself up if I just veg and do Netflix for an entire day or an entire week or an entire month, because, while there's a sacredness to life, there's an experience of just having the experience that's okay too. At least for me, anyway.
Yeah, beautiful. I love those. Those are very one of the things I like I read fantasy books. And
Okay.
one of the reasons I read them is because of playing around with different perceptions about reality, really.
Yeah.
And what's possible and what could happen and all of that. And I think one of the things I value about that, which I also hear, I think, in some of what you're saying, is the way it disconnects me from some sort of fatalistic, pre-decided view of how things are inevitably going to be. Something all your ideas have in common is they're full of possibility and they're full of unpredictability, and they're kind of liberating in that sense. Like the campfire soul tribe. I love that.
Yeah.
I imagine it's almost like there's this campfire in the dark, but with this beautiful fire, and it's sort of suspended somewhere up in the reaches of the cosmos. And this thing is going on, which is full of possibility and acceptance and interest. And the idea of repeating the same life over and over with the opportunity to align with the higher self more and more and more each time.
Mm-hmm.
There's no, you've got to sit the exam and get it right and pass by a certain date. There's space, there's time. We can take our time to do our process in whatever way we need to do it. And that's very, very permission giving, I think, in the way that you were describing it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Your visualization was literally, you articulated it. it's in the dark, if you will, with the campfire being the primary light, but you can't really see, in my perception, you really don't see beyond it. Maybe you see stars, maybe you don't, but there's not like you're in a forest per se. It doesn't have that feel to it. It's just the light of our presence with one another, along with the campfire, represents that feeling of, and it to some degree it is floating a little bit. I mean, and again, it's hard to describe, because it's not a clear picture for me. It's more of a feeling than it is, a tangible. Um, and the to the extent that the repetitiveness portion is, I'm like you. I love fantasy. I love um movies like The Groundhog Day, which is an illustration of one of my perceptions. And by the way, there are a couple theories on that movie, Groundhog Day, that he relived that uh day 3,000 years worth. Like there's some perceptions. I mean, it's like an astronomical number of times he relived that day. But you can see the progression of his evolution, his humanity, his heart, with each encounter. And it's a really, I think maybe that's where that perception came from me, is from that movie. And there's other movies like that and other stories along that line that captivate me, like the movie The Matrix, for example. And there's a number of different movies that represent this experience. And again, I I I take it in because I I want to operate from less fear and more love. And I'm aware that fear can, take hold of me. And ultimate fear is that, fear of death. Like that. I think when I look at even just the concept of fear, if you bring it down to its base level, whatever is happening in your life, the fear of public speaking, is like, well, I mean, if you get to the base of that fear, it's, I'm going to die if I do this. So, so if I can I accept that it's going to be okay, kind of the way my son, articulated, it's going to be okay, then I don't have to live in as much anxiety over things like financially supporting myself. And again, that doesn't mean abandon, you know, like just completely let yourself go and such, but just this narrative that everything is going to be okay. And I'm working on, surrendering to that through these perceptions of what happens when we transition.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so it's almost like you are consciously programming yourself in terms of your relationship with fear, through the medium of your perception of life after death, because you've identified that our perception of life after death is fundamental to our relationship with fear.
Wow, you know what? I've not heard it return back to me in that way. I mean, as you're saying that, I'm like, oh, that's exactly what's going on. I just didn't necessarily frame it in that way, but to some degree, I I believe my relationship with death is to and when we say the word death, I mean transition. So just, I mean, don't take the exact words. The transition is that I'm really navigating those fears, those insecurities, those anxieties that I have in my life. And, now I happen to, and for everyone listening, on some level, I'm blessed with a life where I do spend a lot of time by myself. I'm not distracted by doing. My life has been structured where I'm in the being of it, and most predominant being is in my emotions. And that, I'm going to tell you something, Catherine, that's both a blessing and a curse. Um, I believe that, within the doing of life, we are distracted from our feelings when we're actively doing something. Maybe it's work. And not to suggest you're not experiencing your feelings, but not from a state of awareness, from a state of experience. But if you go to work and you're dealing with a problem at work and you're doing this and you're doing that, you're just not in your you're not in your emotions and feelings to the same degree. And my life isn't structured that way. So I spend an inordinate amount of time, and that's a blessing and a curse. And because of that, I'm faced with more of the see, I was about to say unhealthy or bad, but it's not unhealthy or bad. Fear is not unhealthy or bad. Anxiety is not unhealthy or bad. It's just an emotion. It's just a feeling. I chose a period of time in my life to be really attuned to those feelings. And again, I sometimes look at myself as Woody Allen or Larry David, those two actors when they're on screen, because I almost seem neurotic in this. But I believe if everyone was given the chance to be in this space, we would all be, it's almost humorous how neurotic most human beings are. Kind of coming back to the idea when I said earlier, we're laughing, in the soul tribe, you sit together, go, oh my God, you did that. That's so funny. You beat yourself up, you shamed yourself, you self-crucified, you flogged yourself for 10 years straight. Oh my God, that was so funny. You didn't have to do that.
Yeah.
But you chose that kind of thing. So from that perception, it's rather fascinating. And again, and I say blessing or curse only in that it depends on what lens you want to look at it. Some people listening to this go, oh my God, I wouldn't want to live life the way this person does. And yet this is what I've chosen from a spiritual perspective. And like, I have to laugh at myself at sometimes the amount of pain I will inflict upon myself, you know? And then I come back to, it's going to be okay.
Yeah. Fantastic. So this must have then affected your experience of life, everyday life? This whole kind of...
Yes and no. I'll be candid with you. I still think I'm in, if I haven't ascended to that man or woman level of consciousness and awareness, I do believe my soul is not a new soul. I think I'm in that middle stage of soul. If I'm trying to give you some context of something that I'm not even sure.
Sort of an early 20s soul, maybe, or
No, I think I'm in the dark night of the soul, at least right now. And so I'm certainly, I, I, I don't know how many alliterations I've been at, but I'm certainly becoming more aware. And this is where metamorphosis happens. This is the phoenix rising from the ashes stage of my life. That hero's journey of shift. And so I'm going through a lot of stuff in my life right now. And yet it's interesting because my journey really began 20 years ago after I was going through a divorce, lost my high-end corporate job, and got wiped out in the market crash. And for the next 6 years, I was in a state of depression, deep depression. I went to bed wishing I didn't wake up. I was in deep emotional pain. And it is through personal development, self-help, spiritual work, and therapy was I able to rise above it. And then, 10 years after that, I lost my son, and I was in another transition in my life of pain, but it wasn't as deep a pain as losing my identity. When I lost my identity 20 years ago, I was in deep pain. And so by the time I got to my son, it was a different kind of pain, but it wasn't in the state of depression. And then fast forward 5 years from that, I was in a significant romantic relationship with someone I was deeply in love with. And she didn't feel like we weren't aligned in our purpose in life. And she transitioned, if you will, out of the relationship. And that left me another deep pain. And right now I'm going through a professional shift in my life because of a few variety of reasons. So I'm going through another. And it's interesting as I examine this, today, I would go, why aren't I in a state of depression? Like, and because I have reasons to be in deep depression right now. I mean, I could give you a laundry list of things like, oh my God, that sounds like that would be depressing. And as I reflect back on my journey that began 20 years ago, I have built emotional scaffolding within my life, particularly centered around, fear and death has given me that emotional scaffolding to go, okay, it's not great right now. I'm not feeling great, but I'm still breathing. I can still have a smile on my face. I'm excited to have this conversation. Um, because I'm learning to adopt, but I don't feel it every day. I don't feel it every moment, but I'm learning to adopt. It's all going to be okay.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to frame it any other way, Catherine. I mean, I wish I could say something that was even more profound, or that could be put on a meme, than just simply it's going to be okay. It sounds like a bumper sticker, just do it, like Nike, or type of thing. But it's what I'm working on adopting. It's going to be okay.
Yeah. Well, I've actually you communicated that beautifully, and
Oh,
in a way that, like, very accessibly, because I think it's those like the peak experiences are the ones that are easiest to speak about, and kind of they have a glitter to them, and it's all very exciting and stimulating. It's those experiences in the middle where we're kind of not okay, and we're kind of okay, and we're kind of navigating it. I actually think those places are more important, because those are like real life, everyday real life, that where we get to show up in it, you know?
but I struggled between, but I will still share this with you. I struggle between, you know, there's this beautiful afterlife transition, and that perception versus it's a dial tone, and I'm having this, battle between, for lack of a better word, good and evil. And I'm just only playing with that for a moment, but this perception, and to the extent that, is this all just, spiritual, woo woo spiritual bypassing? Is this, and I play with that, because, I haven't fully surrendered to it. I think I hold the space of hope, and yet I haven't really embodied that as being my true state of being. So, it's fascinating. And to the extent that anyone's listening to this, I said earlier, it's kind of, there's it's a blessing and a curse, or maybe ignorance is bliss, to some extent. And this is my playground for me, and that this is what I chose. Like, I'm like, you really chose this? Like, you could have chose to be Richard Branson, and, flying off in spaceships, and doing all kinds of stuff. That's one perception, I could have chose, but I chose this. Like, and I sometimes go, like, even sometimes like, what were you thinking? But it's learning to, at least for me, to appreciate, it's learning to appreciate and accept myself, even in my foibles, even in my, prickly parts, even that, those picadillos I have. Um, and, as I examine, like, I have this one perception that my soul wants to be rescued, particularly with a life mate, a life partner. And so I'm like, wow, isn't it kind of fascinating that you somehow evolved into becoming a dating and relationship coach, you know, and yet you're single right now. And I'm like, I'm like, and then sometimes I have to grapple with my identity. Well, who the hell are you to teach this stuff if you can't be in relationship? And boy, can I crucify myself, just on that one concept. I can literally beat myself up emotionally, instead of operating from that place of love. And as I, as I'm just even saying this to you out loud, I'm appreciative of this conversation because it's a reminder that at the end of the day, I believe in the concept that the real miracle of life is when we can shift from that fear, uncertainty, doubt to that place of love. Like any shift to love is a genuine miracle, to the extent that that is where I feel a place of serenity. I feel a place of calm. I feel a place of equanimity when I can shift to love. And boy, it is a Herculean task, and I know that even creates a judgment around that, but like self-awareness, is not for the faint of heart.
No kidding.
You have to be willing to get to the ninja level. Like I'm going through my ninja level training, and I'm just still in the early stages of that ninja level training, um, to really become more of an actualized being.
Yeah.
And let me just say this to everybody listening. I do not even remotely profess that I am in such a lightened, self-aware being. I just teach, like what I teach is like, hey, this is what I learned today. Do you want to hear about it? Like that's it. And I may be one day ahead of you, to that particular group of people that follow my work, and I follow other people's work because I feel like they're just one day ahead of me. You know, um, and that's kind of how I live my life from the experience of what happens when we transition.
Fantastic. Absolutely love it. And I just love that illustration of being in the experience of the exploring and the living, and understanding that it's not about, oh, great, I've arrived. I was having a conversation with someone yesterday about this idea of, the minute you say, I've arrived, I'm enlightened now. Who said that? Your ego. You just lost it.
Yeah.
That's it. You lost it. So I really appreciate you sharing all of that, because for me, listening to it, and I'm sure many listeners listening to it, that's a beautiful description of what it's often like in life. When we've chosen to try to be more self-aware, more conscious, less driven by fear, more connected and open to love, all of those things, we've chosen that. And then there's a path. It's a path to be walked, and that description of being on the path. I've got this really strong bias at the moment, Jonathon, about I think we need to value the path more, because so often we're valuing the destination,
Yeah.
the escape from the terrible thing or the arrival at the destination, but not the path in between, because the path is just what's exciting about the path. Well, the path is actually where it all happens, and the destination is just the sign that it all happened. So,
And can I piggyback on that? And it kind of illustrates why I wrote a book called What the Heck is Self-Love Anyway? I believe whenever we experience that vibrational disconnect within ourselves, and we call it fear, we call it anxiety, we call it, judgments, we call it guilt, we call it shame, all of these words, whenever we're out of frequency with our divine self, every time that happens, I always say, well, that's an interesting way to love myself. In other words, like to look at it going, okay, now to return to love. That's an interesting way to love myself. And, and, you know, and believe me, I can sometimes say that 100 times a day, I mean, that's another interesting way to choose to, because I think ultimately this is about learning, self-acceptance, self-love, all those self words. Um, and that's the way I choose. That's the way the path is. And I do find myself forgetting my path a lot. Having this conversation brings me back on my path because I get to talk about it. And I think if we talk about this more frequently, and if we, if instead of watching that, Instagram reel about some influencer doing something, if we just really sat and communed with people from a heart-centered place, if that was happening like that Soul Tribe campfire, you know, um, I think we beings would feel less alone. Um, and and that's my invitation for everybody, is to share what's in your heart with the people that matter most in your life. Spend more time sharing from the heart, not in the head, not the doing, to share from the heart. And and I'll be candid with you, and I kind of want to wrap up with this thought. My capacity to communicate the way I am right now didn't exist 20 years ago. And I it's I think that's where humanity is the next evolution, is to really tap into their heart and be able to express from that heart-centered space. So I just merely try, as a to the extent that I'm a role model or a guide or a teacher, whatever, label that I'm given from a professional or even a personal level, is I want to encourage human beings to start listening from, like, list talking from their heart, and also listening from their heart. If that's one message I can give for this conversation, is that invitation for everybody. And I hope this conversation inspires someone to really begin to talk from their heart and listen from their heart.
Beautiful. Well, they would have to have a heart of stone not to respond to that, Jonathan. So, in fact, this has been such a fantastic conversation. I thought it would be. I was very excited and intrigued about this, and I think I might do some more episodes with people talking about the afterlife and the relationship with that and the perception of that, and how that then affects the experience and the way of living in our actual lives. So,
Yeah.
Jonathan, that's been absolutely wonderful. We've actually talked quite a lot today about a whole variety of angles on it. Has there been a favorite part of our conversation today for you?
Uh, well, I think the part that resonates with me most is how um my perception of fear and death has been a driving force for my evolution, at least this facet of my evolution. And it's interesting because, I've been at it for 6 years since my son passed away. And I'm like, well, I keep thinking I should evolve to a new level, but and then I go, well, am I stuck at this level? You know, and I'm just unpacking it. Um, and I don't, like that. I'm wrestling between, am I stuck at this level, or am I supposed to process it more? And by you putting a perception on it, I want to journal on that. Because I feel like there's a next evolution. I just don't know what that is yet.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, as someone said to me the other day, Catherine, this whole business about being open to not knowing, I find that very difficult because because I can't understand it.
Ed, welcome to the human experience.
So, yeah, and I would like to suggest, just from I don't know you terribly well, right? However, but just from my perception, I think you have moved to another level in the last 6 years, in fact, and that you are transitioning as you go. But that's just one person's reflection based
Yeah.
on my experience of you and what you've communicated today. So take that as you will.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And thank you to the listeners and the watchers. That's all for Truth and Transcendence today. You can find our other episodes on truthandtranscendence.com. Please do give a thumbs up, a 5-star rating, share with your friends, and comment on what we were discussing today if you would like to do that. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time. And thank you again, Jonathon Aslay.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it, Catherine.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. It really helps if you give a thumbs up, a 5-star rating, a review, and share with your friends. If you're looking for transformational coaching or an intensive transformational weekend workshop experience, I can help with that. You can actually help the show by making a donation. Until next time, take care.